In this lecture, we examine a city, Karanis, where the inhabitants took a cultural path antithetical to that seen at Timgad. This agricultural community of 2,000 to 3,000 people in the fertile region of Egypt exemplifies the cultural and urban diversity of the Roman Empire, even in its most rural and apparently obscure areas. It contained a mixed population of Roman veterans, descendants of Hellenistic Greek occupiers, and local Egyptians, who together illustrate daily urban life in the farm belt of ancient Egypt, breadbasket of the Roman world, in AD 300. Well, thanks to the scores of documents and wide range of domestic objects excavated from the site, the lives and even names of the city's inhabitants are known to us. Their small city, with little, if any, social or economic stratification, demonstrates life in such a mixed community, where only 14% of the inhabitants were Roman citizens. Now, I think this statistic is interesting, and it actually supports what we have heard previously in Roman literature, and that is, it is consistent with the long-standing Roman practice of not making lots of citizens. The Roman Emperor Augustus himself said not to make a lot of citizens. The Romans liked to only make citizens where they had to reward somebody, and otherwise they ruled through local governments, not turning everybody into citizens until much later in the empire, which we'll get to. They preferred to use non-citizen labor in the provinces where at all possible. Well, this multicultural community has parallels, I think, in the farming communities of the modern world. Notably, the city of Karanis is economically integrated into the wider world. The produce of Karanis, mainly grain and olive oil, as what scholars will term a producer city, feeds the consumer city, Rome, through the ships that sail from the two terminals of the grain fleet, from Alexandria to Ostia. Linking these four cities, Karanis, Alexandria, Ostia, and finally Rome, together in the long-range trade of the Roman Empire. Karanis sends its commodities out to Alexandria, Ostia, and finally Rome, and it hosts Roman soldiers who are posted in the region, as well as having regular contacts with neighboring villages and with public officials from Alexandria. So although it's isolated and rural, it is in fact very well connected to the world at large. Now, the city of Karanis, which is in modern terms, in the modern Arabic, Qom Aushim, is about 50 miles southwest of Cairo in the Fayoum area of Egypt. This is fertile agricultural land that has been farmed since the time of the pharaohs. That is, actually, since the old kingdom of the pharaohs. This area, with its actually, it's one of the very few fertile areas in Egypt, and pretty much the only one off of the Nile. So it's of incredible importance for agriculture. Well, the city itself of Karanis was founded in the 3rd century BC under the Ptolemies, under the Greek rulers who came here after the death of Alexander the Great. Nothing from that period remains, however. Karanis was refounded under the Roman Emperor Augustus in the late 1st century BC. Augustus settled military veterans here in a Roman military colony of the type that we looked at Timgad. And he restored the productivity of the land, or I should say fairly, they restored the productivity of the land by renewing the critical irrigation systems. The community enjoyed modest prosperity until the end of the 3rd century AD, when its gradual abandonment began, leading to it being fully reclaimed by the desert by the 5th century, after 800 years of occupation. Now, I've deliberately given little attention to excavators in these lectures, choosing to concentrate instead on the material remains and not on the practice of archaeology. But at Karanis, we should acknowledge that we only know as much as we do thanks to the work of one man, Francis Kelsey. Now, Francis Kelsey was a professor of Latin language and literature at the University of Michigan with a passion for archaeology. Kelsey set out in 1924 to dig a city so that he could explore the lives of common people in the ancient world. In the 1920s, this was an extraordinary decision for a number of reasons. First, Egyptology had at that time a 100-year history of exploration and the quest for exclusively objects of value, those that could be sold to museums or collectors. So Francis Kelsey grew up in a time where the predominant form of archaeology was object-oriented archaeology. In the area of Karanis in the Fayum, that meant papyrus of the types we discussed from the city of Deir el-Medina. These were the papyrus documents that we find throughout Egypt. Second, all of that collecting effort from that object-oriented archaeology was focused on material from the age of the pharaohs. So here's 1924. Think about the tomb of King Tut for just a minute. Discovered in 1922. That expedition was funded by a British nobleman whose expectation was that he would get the material from King Tut's tomb. And so people are funding expeditions with the idea that they're going to bring the material home. They'll get at least half of everything. And that's the expectation. They're digging for wonderful things. So Kelsey changes that. Not only that, he's not digging for stuff from the age of the pharaohs. The later Greco-Roman layers in Egypt, the ones that are superimposed above the earlier pharaonic ones, were generally dug through hurriedly and with great destruction. That is, archaeology is destruction. And so you just dig through that later stuff to get to what you want. And people did that routinely for the last 100 years at this time to reach the lower pharaonic material. Kelsey rejected both of these in favor of searching for information, not objects, and in focusing on the Greco-Roman period, not the pharaonic. Although Karanis had been mined by local farmers for the mud brick used to build most of its structures, much of it was still untouched. And this happens, in fact, today in Egypt. Farmers will go to ancient sites that are largely built of mud brick, and they'll just farm or quarry out that mud brick, and they will use it as fertilizer, spread it on their fields. So ancient sites are constantly being, dissolved one mud brick at a time as farmers reuse this material. It's fertile. You can hardly blame them. Well, what Kelsey found at Karanis was the quintessential lost city. Thanks to the dry climate in Egypt, much of the organic material, such as building timber, tools, bowls, wickerwork, baskets and so forth, shoes, papyri, rope, leather, and clothing, is all preserved. Altogether, what he found, what they brought out from Karanis, was 45,000 objects of daily life from the Greco-Roman period. And these were extraordinary things. And that includes some really interesting finds that are not terribly visual, but exciting. That includes the crushed olive pits from the oil mills. Apparently, and we know this only from Karanis, these were collected and used by bakers as fuel for their bread ovens. Nobody knew this until we got to Karanis, and that explained how, where they're getting the fuel for these ovens, because there's not a lot of wood around. And we can do, thanks to these excavations, just as Francis Kelsey hoped. We can study the lives of common people in this community. So I think we need to give him credit for that. Well, in layout, the town consisted of two main avenues running north-south, with irregular cross streets and hundreds of houses in irregular groups. None of them orthogonally planned, and none of them we frankly know what the organization was. As the religious spaces and dedications at Timgad demonstrated, they demonstrated the relentless Romanitas of that community. The temples at Karanis give a very clear indicator of the population's integration of all three of the cultures we have here, native Egyptian, Greek, and Roman. There were two major temples in the city, called by the excavators the North Temple and the South Temple. The North Temple dates to the Roman period, but it's purely Egyptian in design. It has no Greek or Roman elements. Although built by and for this Roman colony, It doesn't project the sort of Romanness seen at Timgad with its colossal Capitolium. The South Temple, in contrast, has a longer history. It was first built in the late 1st century BC at the very beginning of the Augustan colonial foundation. In the later 1st century AD, a traditional Roman temple was built over the old one. And I should say the form of the old one is not well understood because it's disassembled and covered up. This new Roman temple, or Roman-style temple, however, was dedicated to two local Egyptian crocodile gods, Nepheros and Petasuchos. These are avatars of the crocodile god Dolbek. That is, they're components of his identity that appear. And so these are actually local Egyptian crocodile deities. Interestingly enough, the dedicatory inscription above the door of this Roman-style temple dedicated to local Egyptian gods was written in Greek. The irregularly carved letters indeed look like it was carved by someone who had never done this before. It's pretty rough. But they credited the temple originally to the Roman Emperor Nero. Certainly, this was a politically motivated fiction. It seems very unlikely that Nero actually paid for the temple, but its construction may actually date, thanks to that dedication, we think we can date it to about 66-67. This was during the time of Nero's trip to Greece, his only great foreign trip. During that period, many Greek communities, including Alexandria, commemorated Nero's trip to Greece in various ways. And that is, they made dedications in Nero's name. And so we think that this temple dates to 66 to 67. It's Roman construction, a Roman-style temple, and dedication to Nero, or fictionally dedication by Nero, are designed to really celebrate the Roman authority. The fact that the inscription is made in Greek tells us about the literacy of the individuals here. They're Greek speakers and Greek readers. Well, Nero's name was erased from the temple and replaced with that of his uncle and predecessor Claudius after Nero's death in 68. So it wasn't up there very long. Claudius was probably selected for this honor because, first off, he had already been named a god, and so what better person? Also, his full name, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, was very close to Nero's official name, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. And so it was an easy fix. Carve out Nero, put in Tiberius, and suddenly it's to Claudius. Well, 27 different Greek, Roman, and Egyptian deities were worshipped at Karanis. We don't have temples for all of them. In fact, most are only known from small statuettes or idols that are found in these sanctuaries or in houses across the site. So really, I think they represent popular religion or individual votives by people in the community, not grand sanctuaries. Many of the houses here contain niches for small statues, probably as a household shrine. These represent a long tradition of personal religion of the type that we can see in cities as early as Çatalhöyük in the early Neolithic, and in Egyptian cities such as Kahun, Deir el-Medina, and perhaps best preserved at Amarna, where every house had a small shrine and a small altar in it. And that sort of cultural continuity we find here at Karanis, even in a city with Greek speakers in the Roman Empire. Well, the vast majority of the people in Karanis were farmers, although the second largest industry was textiles. Some of these were made from linen, but the majority were made from local wool. There were also skilled individuals like you need in a small town, carpenters, potters, and even a doctor, although there was no scorpion charmer as we heard about at Deir el-Medina. There was a professional hairdresser. I cannot figure that one out, I must admit. And we only know about her from one reference. And I don't know if this professional hairdresser was or if she came through on a circuit or what. But there was a professional hairdresser, and there was a flautist. This flautist probably performed for religious ceremonies for a fee and not as a concert performer. In a lot of sacrifices, for example, you need to have a flute player playing in the background of a sacrifice to block noises that are not propitious. And so you would pay them a small fee to play during that ceremony. Well, the farmers grew a number of crops, including wheat and other grains, most importantly wheat and other grains, as well as pulses, grapes, radishes, and tree fruits and nuts, such as dates, figs, peaches, pistachios, walnuts, and olives. The grapes were pressed to make wine. Wheat was the most important of these crops, both for the townspeople and for export. Now, since we're in the period here, or we're talking about the period of AD 300, I need to talk about what's going on economically in the larger Roman world at this period. During the 3rd century AD, the Romans suffered a number of empire-wide catastrophes. The Roman Empire itself was broken up into 3 parts. The Romans only held the center part. There was a breakaway Gallic Republic on the west and a breakaway republic or empire of its own in the east. Every Roman emperor between Septimius Severus in 211 AD and the emperor who passed away in 284, that's altogether 25 Roman emperors in a little over 50 years, every one of those was assassinated. There was chaos. There was plague, invasion, economic collapse. It was bad. In 284 AD, one man took over, really, the Roman Emperor Diocletian. And he stepped in and systematically solved every one of Rome's problems. He secured the borders. He ensured that there would be an end to assassination. He took care of everything. And part of that was economic. And one of his economic features was starting from really right in 300 AD onward, taxes were paid in kind in the Roman world rather than in money. What this means is the major tax paid by the people of Karanis was in grain, although everybody who was a skilled laborer would pay in what they had, payment in kind. The potter paid in pots, the weavers would pay in fabric, and so on. There was a separate meat tax as well to support the local military detachment. How did this farm-based economy work? This is really curious. Well, thanks to the documents from Karanis, we know some details that illuminate this as we have nowhere else in the Roman world. Local officials, on behalf of the imperial government, administered the transport of tax grain from Karanis to Alexandria. So in order to have people pay taxes in kind, by 300, the Romans had to develop something they never had before in taxes, and that was a vast bureaucracy to keep track of all of these taxes in kind. There's a lot of record keeping here. Weavers, for example, would weave fabric for the army. Part of that was recorded by the, I kid you not, Office of Cloaks. You get the idea. Every type of in-kind tax had a different bureaucracy and a different office to track it. Because think about this. If you have money and you take in cash, you can distribute that anywhere. But if you take in objects in kind, like military cloaks, you can't just send those anywhere. You've got to know where they have to go. And so you have to have reports from every military detachment around the Roman world, how many cloaks they need, and a central warehouse to hold the cloaks, and then people to send them back out. It's a logistical nightmare. But this is what they did, and it stabilized the economy. Anyway, with the tax grain, farmers paid supplementary amounts as additional tax, all of which were recorded by these Roman officials. In an example from Karanis, note that the grain is recorded in local Egyptian dry quantities. This is a quote from this document from Karanis. To Aurelius Cassius and Aurelius Isidorus of the village of Karanis, greeting. We have received from you in the same harbor of Leucogion including charges of 10% and 2%, that's the tax rate, grain on behalf of the village of Karanis, barley to the amount of exactly 1,976 artabas. In the consulship of our lords Valerius Licinius Augustus and Flavius Valerius Constantinus, son of the Augusti, on the 5th day before the calends of September. Note a couple of things about this. The officials, although they have Greek personal names, Cassius and Isidorus, they both share the same Roman name, Aurelius, which was shared by everyone who was made a citizen of Rome in AD 212 by the Emperor Caracalla. Caracalla decided, unfortunately as it turns out for the Roman world, that he would grant citizenship to all free non-Roman males in the empire, and he did so in AD 212. Here, since this document dates somewhere between 309 and 313, these men descend from that grant of citizenship almost exactly 100 years earlier. I say it was unfortunate that Caracalla gave citizenship because Roman citizens didn't pay a lot of taxes at the time, and so he destabilized the tax base of the Roman world and really collapsed the economy. Good work. So these Roman officials, with Roman family names using the official Roman date, but a local measuring system. At Alexandria, the grain was again stored in granaries to await shipment to Rome. The grain fleet, typically sailing in the spring, made the hazardous journey to Italy, some 1,700 miles, in 1 or 2 months. Now, this is about the public buildings and so on at Karanis, but we should look at the houses as well. The houses at Karanis were of a type found across the Middle East and North Africa. Made of mud brick, they consisted of 3 rooms built around a courtyard, altogether making a walled compound of perhaps 2 or maybe even 3 stories with a flat roof. Houses shared party walls of a type that's familiar in the area as far back as Deir el-Medina in the Egyptian New Kingdom. Here also, the only windows in the houses are high up on the walls for security. People can't look in and they can't get in. Some houses also had stone steps, stone lintels, and small gardens. Many were equipped with animal pens for livestock. At least 6 had dovecotes, that is columbaria in the Latin, for raising doves for food. Evidence was found of horses, mules, cows, sheep, pigs, dogs, gazelles, camels, and donkeys raised in the city. At least some houses had cellars as well, probably for storing commodities that needed to be kept cool. Most of these houses belonged to the farmers, because that's the majority of the population. But the craftsmen and a few other professionals used their houses in ways that make it clear that they were considered economic units as well as domestic space. One mud brick house with a stone entrance was excavated by Francis Kelsey's team, and 26,000 coins in jars and cloth bags were found under the floor. The house belonged to the local banker. Having no bank, and apparently not even room in the temple, which was the usual alternative, he buried the money under his house. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, many people decorated their homes as much as their means allowed. We don't find mosaic floors or marble revetments as in Roman houses in other cities, but frequently interior walls were plastered and painted, sometimes with scenes of nature. Woven mats and possibly cushions covered parts of the floor, and furniture included a great deal of wooden furniture, wooden stools, tables, and beds. Wooden house doors were locked with sliding wooden bolts that could be opened with wooden keys. These are really tremendous. If you ever get a chance to see these, go to the Kelsey Museum. That's the Archaeological Museum at the University of Michigan. It's named for Francis Kelsey now, I think, fairly. And you can see all these on display, including all that material, such as the doors. They brought that as well, and these really intricate locks and keys you see there, along with just a huge amount of the daily life material, from sandals and robes all the way through to the baskets and so on. Well, although Karanis is believed by some scholars to have been a producer city, the flow of objects and culture went both ways. Connections to the larger Roman world were found at Karanis, and not just in the Roman soldiers stationed here. Although there weren't many imported or luxury goods, there were a few found. Examples include imported ceramic tableware, jewelry, sculpture. There's a nice little small-scale marble Venus that was found here, along with ivory combs, ebony pieces, pearls, fine fabrics, and inlaid boxes. Also Roman coins, some in large numbers, and a full Roman bath complex, all of which argue for cultural connections with the larger Roman world. The city was unfortunately connected also in terms of disease. There's tragic evidence of trends found in the wider world in the decline of the population here at Karanis after AD 165. That was the year of the Great Antonine Plague that swept through the Roman Empire, killing a third of its population. We see a rise here in the number of graves at this site as well. The Roman period papyri discovered at Karanis provide some interesting details on daily life and Roman administration in the provinces. From them, we learn of some of the universal conditions of urban life, such as local crimes, including assaults, thefts, burglaries, and vandalism. There are also civil cases, such as land disputes and estates to be settled. One example of a papyrus comes from a roll that was originally about 100 feet in length, of which we have about 6,500 lines well preserved. Those lines represent about a year of tax collections at Karanis. It shows the payments taxpayers in the village of Karanis made for various taxes, including poll taxes and land taxes. Well, Karanis exemplifies life off the beaten path in the Roman world. It gives us a view of the lives of common people and of the culture of a small agricultural city away from the Roman centers of power, and yet linked to them through its precious commodities, trade, and Roman culture, from the calendar to names to religion. The inhabitants of Karanis seem to have created what might be considered layered identities. They worship the traditional Egyptian gods, but do so in a Roman-style temple, probably built to honor a Roman emperor. They seem to represent the deliberate limits of Roman influence and culture at the outer reaches of the empire, yet they're still dependent on Rome and the regional capitals that kept the empire functioning in the 4th century AD. We'll learn more about those regional capitals and how control shifted away from Rome to them in our next lecture on the city of Constantinople.